Well, good day again here. Welcome. Very nice to see you all. Hope you rested a little bit from last night. It was late. We are going to the second part, the second day after lunch. Presentation of Charles Esche, director from the Abbemuseum.
Esche.
I'm sorry?
Esche.
Charles Esche, excuse me. I'm sorry, Charles Esche, director of Van Abbemuseum in Eindhoven. Next to that, also professor at Goldsmiths, University of the Arts, and advisor at the Jan van Eyck Academy here. So you'll be seeing him more often. Charles will be doing a lecture. This is also as part of an introduction. We ask all of the advisors to introduce themselves, and we thought it would be nice to connect it also to the introduction week to have at least one or two advisors here. The idea was to have Rosa van der Graaf here as well, but because of private circumstances, she is not able to make it, so that's a pity. So afterwards, after this lecture, we have ample time to sit together downstairs for a coffee and a cake, and then afterwards we are free. So that's good. So tomorrow we have the field walks. So I'll give it now to Charles.
Okay.
And I wish you all the good luck. Yes.
Thanks a lot, and apologies for being a bit chaotic. The PowerPoint crashed when I was just trying to write something that would be a little bit more aligned to Rolando's talk and try to address those two together, really. And I think, firstly, for full disclosure, Rolando and I have worked together quite closely, and Van Abbe is the host and also contributed to the Decolonial Summer School since 2018, I think. That's been mostly online because of these current situations, but we hope this summer for it to be physical again, which would be, I mean, online has its advantages, obviously, because people can join in from many more places, but also the capacity to bring together a group of people allows a kind of relationality, which he spoke about, to build in a far greater way. And I think it's that relationality in a way that has been quite fundamental to how we've been thinking about the museum. So what I'm going to do is tell you a story about a museum that's about an hour away from here by train, called the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, which is a particular city, very different from Maastricht, in a different region, but still in the Catholic part of the Netherlands. So in a part which has its own sort of history of internal colonization, you could say, in relationship to the West, to Holland, the real Holland. I suppose my story is going to be about, in a sense, the absence of those histories and how they need to be included. So it chimes really with, some of the questions that we talked about last night around what does it mean to go back into the archive or go back into history, to remember, to think about Earth time for a practice which is contemporary. Is that better? Yeah. You can hear me? Okay. So what does it mean for a practice that would go? I think one of the questions that some of you had after Orlando's talk was this idea that is it a sort of anti-technological return to some kind of past utopia? Yeah? And I think it's absolutely not. But I understand that the modern ideology sits so much in the DNA of art, but also of our education systems. This idea of futurity, which we talked about, this idea of progress, this idea that we can make the world better on the basis of starting with a clean slate, with a blank canvas, with a white cube. That sits so much in the DNA that when it's challenged, then one of the reactions is, but does that mean we lose any sense of hope or any sense of horizon? And the fact is that reaction is very normal, and it was my reaction initially, because I was brought up, even more so than you, because I'm from an older generation, where this ideology of the modern was unquestioned. So then, at the moment when it becomes questioned, then there's a kind of very normal. It's again like this sort of guilt trigger, this guilt instinct, which is triggered by a lot of knowledge of coloniality upon bodies like mine, upon white cis male bodies. There's an immediate sense of guilt. And that guilt is, as Rolando said, about recentering yourself, saying, oh, it's all about me. Look at poor me. You know, I'm the one who's actually suffering through this. Yeah, which is, when you think about it, quite horrible, but nevertheless a sort of normal reaction. But also a sense of, yeah, but look at all the good things I've done. You know, to quote, you know, Mussolini, I made the trains run on time, in a way. Yeah? Don't look at that, look at this. So there's lots of elements of that reaction that are, you know, it wasn't really me or the others. Look at all the good things I've done. Yes, I feel guilty, but that's also, look at me, I'm suffering. All those reactions are completely understandable, yeah? And we need, in a sense, to work through them. We can't suppress them. We can't repress them. We can't repress them, but we can. But we need to look them in squarely, if you like, and come to terms with them as part of our life. Yeah, and we have examples of how this can be done. Truth and reconciliation, the process of denazification in Germany, processes where there has been a social, a collective coming to terms with the past. Vergangenheitsbewältigung in German, which is a really nice word for a fairly horrible process, but a necessary process. Yeah? And I would argue, as a sideline, that one of the crucial failures of the European Union and the crucial failures of Europe as a culture after the Second World War was to isolate the crimes of Nazi Germany as a singular occurrence, rather than understand it as part of an ideological construct which goes back to colonialism. And I think that separation, so that the Germans were guilty, which meant that the guilt, if you like, the guilt feelings of the French or the British or the Dutch or the Spanish or the Portuguese could somehow be shifted onto one particular scapegoat. And Nazi Germany, in a way, became a scapegoat, however awful it was. This is not to excuse it, but became a scapegoat for a much wider set of ideological problems, which we in Europe still have to confront. And so one of the ideas of never again, which was one of the calls that happened after the Second World War, never again to National Socialism, never again to fascism. Of course, we can ask how much that now still, in your generation, is still relevant. But certainly for mine, it was very important, that idea that there was a sort of block on political discourse at a certain point along the spectrum of right-left, which you couldn't go beyond, because if you went beyond that, it led to Auschwitz, and we weren't going there again. That block, because it was directed so much at a particular moment of genocide, a particular moment of racial terror, meant that never again became too narrowly defined. And so rather than never again to coloniality, never again to colonialism, it became never again to a very particular kind. And I think that's where we see the revival now of certain tendencies on the right in Europe. And I'm talking really about Europe here very specifically. It's precisely because of this failure to connect one manifestation of this ideology, which had particular uniforms and particular salutes, and I'm not going to do all those things, but you know what I mean, particular black and white footage, if you like, of what it all looked like, that was isolated from the wider picture. And I think we need to address the wider picture. So that's just a little bit in introduction to how I'll try to talk about what we've done in the museum over the last while in an attempt to connect it to Rolando's story. So if you could see, Rolando is sketching a theoretical framework in which we as a museum operate. And so we're going to talk about practice to some degree. And I have to say as a caveat that practice is always more disappointing than theory. I think that's something that is always true, because when you actually deliver something, and this is true for you as artists or designers or people that are working on projects, yeah, the theory itself encompasses a bigger set of possibilities than when you look at a case study, when you look at something specific. So we're going to look at specifics, and there, and I think very rightly, there's the opportunity to sort of tear apart the specifics, to understand what's wrong with those specifics. And through that, we can understand more about the theory. Yeah? So there's a backwards and forwards. And I know if Rolando was here, he'd say that he appreciates this working out in practice, because through that, you learn where the theory also needs to develop. Yeah? So when we think about what can artists contribute, could ask the same of what can theorists contribute to this transition, to this change, to this need to think about our relationship to Earth, to the fact that we are, as Rolando talks about, our well-being is grounded on the exploitation and suffering of other living beings. That in that process of coming to terms with that, these steps that we make are there in order to test out certain possibilities. And that's, I think, where the core possibility lies in art, in the production of cultural manifestations, if we want to call it that. Yeah? Art as a manifestation of a particular cultural context. In that process, I think we can test out where we need to go. And if we don't do that, if it remains at a kind of level of criticality, yeah, at the level of pointing fingers and criticizing what exists, but not proposing with all the vulnerability that a proposition has, then we end up in I think, a situation which I grew up in really in the 1990s, where criticality was totally dominant, but proposition was almost absent from that. So what had been proposed in the previous era, the 70s and 80s, the idea of there is no alternative, that liberal democracy, the end of history of Fukuyama and things like this, all arguments that were, in my upbringing, sort of fundamental to understanding that, yes, we can be critical of liberal democracy, but actually we can't offer anything else. And the end, of course, of real existing socialism was a great weapon to beat anybody who would come up with any proposal. Because, you want to propose something different, that way leads to the Gulag, that way leads to Stalin, so forget it. Let's carry on doing what we're doing. And that has been an incredibly strong argument to stop possibility. And I have to be honest, it was only really when I started to understand, and it took me a while, to understand the challenge of decoloniality, the challenge of decolonizing, which is an endless process that we will never reach. It's important to say there is no such thing as a decolonial institute or anything like that. But it's the steps, maybe baby steps, but steps towards an idea of decolonizing ourselves, our spirits, our minds, our bodies, but then ultimately collectively to decolonize ourselves as a group, as collective. That process is the first time that I felt there was a kind of proposition which I could get behind. However critically managed it was, it had in the seeds of it a propositional element. And that was the first one, really, in my lifetime since communism, that felt like it had a possibility in it. So that's why it's, why for me at least, it's absolutely crucial, because it offers a framework in which you can move, rather than simply point fingers or wag fingers and say how bad it is. So what I'm going to do is take you through, I'm going to use some images, which I hope will appear at some point. Will they appear? So this is the museum that was built in 1936. So just before the Second World War, so just before some of the foundational stones that we're talking about, as a modern art museum. And it was founded by Henry van Abbe, who we'll return to in a minute, by gifting the building actually to the city council. So it was already a kind of public-private partnership at an early stage. And the city council of Eindhoven buying a group of his works. I don't really have time to go into the full story of what those works were and things like that. It's another story, because I'll go into Henry van Abbe as a person and where his money came from. But it was a modern art museum, and it was an international modern art museum. But the works that were represented are not what we would now associate with the avant-garde. Yeah, so they were, we could call them, if we wanted to be a little bit dismissive, which is unfair, I think, but we could call them something like a classic bourgeois collection. So that was what it started in 1936. Very quickly, of course, the Second World War came, and the National Socialist regime here, under German tutelage, but under a civilian regime, which is important to remember, took over. And so really, in some ways, the classical history of the Van Abbe Museum, the one that I inherited when I came in 2005, a long time ago now, was one of beginning after the Second World War. So in a sense, this sort of idea of the Second World War as this break in time, but also this exception, this thing that does not connect the Second World War period to the post-Second World War period. That there's a new beginning, represented, for instance, in art by a movement like Cobra, that goes back to sort of childhood representation, childish representation, let's say, in order to think about a rebirth, a renaissance, a re-emerging. So the 20th century is broken very much into these blocks, or certainly was until we got out of the 20th century, was broken into this pre-war and post-war period that was often quoted as being two definite moments, with the war as some sort of exception that wasn't really addressed. So this is 1936, and this is 2003. So we skip ahead a little bit, but what we see here is is a sort of classic, provincial effort to mirror the main dominant movement after '89, I think particularly in museums, which was of art museums, let's say, but it also extends to other museums, which was not really to question the ideology guiding the collection or guiding the processes of what is represented by the museum, but more to investigate. And this was really the condition, I think, of the 90s, and a lot before the financial crisis of 2008. Let's say that as a period of time from '89 to 2008, that 20 years. In that period, there was not this questioning. There was a certain criticality, but there was not this questioning of sort of fundamentals. But there was an idea of growth. Yeah? So when we talk about growth and the consequences for the climate, the consequences for our relationship with Earth, it stems from, I mean, obviously it goes much further back to 1492, but much of it stems from a 20-year period where there was, I mean, obviously there were singular voices, but there was very little critique of that discourse that had an effect, that had an impact into the policy decisions that were made. In a sense, this was an idea that growth, that economic and monetary salvation was the route to progress, to development, to all these words which are associated with it. They always existed, but by the 90s they were the singular argument which dominated almost all discourses. So whether they were cultural, political, economic, or social, those discourses were dominated by that period, by that position. That growth, that the trickle down, as it was called at the time, the idea that growth at the top would eventually trickle down to those at the bottom, and that would lift everybody. That was such a dominant narrative that it was almost impossible to think outside of it. So growth also affected the museums. So if you look at the real estate square meters that museums built in the 90s, it was almost second to no other period, actually. So many museums from, let's say from the late 80s onwards, if you cover that a period of 20 years, so many museums were invented, grew extensively. Yeah? So this extension of the Van Ava Museum increased it by 3 times the size, its original size. But actually what happened is that a sort of reproduction of the architecture of the original building and a reproduction of the ideology of the original building was what was at stake. Yeah, so you have a few weird postmodern angles and things like that in the building, but essentially it's reproducing itself. It's not building this building in order to do something else. The argument would be we have a big collection and we don't have enough room to show it, so we need to have more room to show it, more room to do the same thing. And that loop, I think, that was we can trace these loops back. It's not that there are sort of such radical changes, but it's what is the dominant discourse of a particular time. So you can always find those discourses further back. Yeah, you can find this discourse in Hayek if you want in the 1940s or even earlier. Yeah, in the Viennese economic neoliberal school, early liberal school. But its dominance in this period meant that museums were following this route. And I suppose what's interesting about that is that the museums would often claim to be unique and autonomous and following their own agendas. So there was a lot of emphasis in these periods on the uniqueness of this building, rather than on the idea that this is following a trend of museum building. So everybody was claiming, and maybe we still do that in some ways, but when Rolando was talking about the individual and the collective, the focus was always, and I think this continues today, on this sort of individual differentiation of Eindhoven being different from the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. We went through its own building process, or Boijmans van Bonneke, which is going through its own building process, yeah, or Bonnefanto, which went through its building process, which is here. Yeah, they all went through their building process, but they all understood themselves as having a different motivation to do so. And it's only with the benefit of hindsight, perhaps, or with an understanding that it's not individual, but it's actually the collective which is determining this, that you understand that we're simply doing, and that's, I think, what we're doing by trying to make some steps towards decolonizing. We're simply following something which is allowed by the society, allowed by the collective. Yeah, if we had tried to do this 10 years ago, and we wouldn't have because we didn't know about it, but if we had tried, people would have simply rejected it. You have to address, and this is true, I think, for your work as well, to be attentive, to have antennae for what is developing, maybe the weak signals. But you need those signals within the collective in order to carry out your work. And so that should teach us something about the question of individuality. This is not an individual museum. Of course it is, and it has specificities. But it's not an individual museum in a sense that this building is the product of something which is much bigger than the decision of the city of Eindhoven to fund this, or the European Union, which also partly funded it. It's caught up in a whole other series, and it's a whole other series of networks and of forces that are driving society in certain directions. And then the interesting thing is to look at those forces, to look at those ideologies, because in a sense they're ideologies in a sort of Marxist sense. The projection on the messiness of the world, a projection of a kind of order and a rationality. So that process is something that we see, in bricks and mortar, if you like, in this building, and the lack of originality is important. Now, what is this museum? I'm being a bit slow, actually. I have to go a bit faster. But what is this museum, and what does what is a character sketch of this museum? If we were to take away for a moment some of the things that we've done in terms of decoloniality, because we would maybe add a certain character sketch onto this, but what was it certainly in 2008, 2009 or so, when I was there? So it's defining itself as a modern and contemporary art museum. Yeah, so there's an awful lot that's excluded there. No? You're talking about modern and contemporary art, and you're talking about the sort of relationship of this building to a museum, to a history of museums. Go back to Wunderkammer, to go back to certain historical precedents in the Enlightenment, essentially. Yeah, the British Museum, the Preußische Besitzung, the Louvre, etc., etc. So that's how it defined itself. It also took over, and this is after the Second World War, of course, what we could say was more or less what I would like to say is a sort of Cold War or NATO set of definitions of the role of art and culture. So what you see in those definitions, and again, that's a long story, but is a notion of autonomy, freedom, as being a characteristic, an aspect of society that art should exhibit. So art's role was to be free and autonomous within the instrumentalization of art in the American occupied zone, you could say, of Western Europe and the United States itself, yeah? Or American ideologically occupied zone. It also had this idea written into it and was established before, obviously, the Second World War, this idea of an avant-garde, that there was a direction which art was traveling in, and the task of the artist was to be as far along that line as possible in order to be in front of the rest. Yeah? Because avant-garde simply means being in front of the guard, yeah? Being in front of the main body. So in order to be in front, you need to know where you're going to. So the job is to sketch out a direction of travel and then say at the farthest reach of that direction of travel, we can already see this artist, a conceptual artist, a Solowet, or we can already see Jörg Immendorf, yeah, as somehow representing something in that far distance on that horizon, which we will all eventually get to. And that's written into modernism, which is also a pre-Second World War activity, of course. It's written into modernism, both the modernism of the Soviet and Russian avant-garde and the modernism of the post-war period in the West. This idea of the avant-garde. Of course, what you could say, and one sort of argument that I would have, is that when you don't know the direction of travel anymore, then that avant-garde simply becomes a detached minority, somewhere out there, perhaps going completely the wrong direction, but somehow sort of isolated within itself. And it's interesting that we talk now about bubbles and elites and things like that. In a way, they've replaced the idea of the avant-garde. Yeah? That art is its own bubble, that the art world is a sort of elitist structure which has its own logic, its own set of criteria for judging good and bad. And that shift from avant-garde to elite is not something that seems contradictory. It's actually, I think, written into the idea of the avant-garde in the first place. But this was what we were looking for. So the ambition of the museum, and that's certainly the ambition that I had when I came in, I think, is to be as avant-garde as possible. And to invite the artists that represent that idea of a forward-looking, future-orientated vision. Now, when we start to talk about decoloniality, then that becomes, well, if we say absurd, that we know which side I'm talking from. But it becomes problematic, no? If we think about a relationship to ancestors, then suddenly it becomes problematic. A Picasso, which doesn't acknowledge the influence of the sculptures that were bought by contemporary artists in Congo in the first years of the 20th century, brought to Paris, then was seen and then influenced the development of Cubism. If that recognition is not done, or it's simply done as sort of inert material that sparked off a genius concept, if those people are not acknowledged, if their cultural context is not acknowledged, then the reason that can happen is because of the idea of an avant-garde and being future-orientated. But the removal of that context is a wound, yeah? Is the colonial difference. So we have it in the core of art history. Yeah? Picasso represents the colonial difference, however complex he is. As a communist, as somebody who we'll see later has a close relationship to artists from the global south in certain ways, in Algeria, in Cuba through Wilfredo Lam and things like that. That's all true at the same time. Yeah? But the way, and sometimes it's not even the individual artist, it's important to point that out, it's the way the story is told. That's what we'll move on to. So it's that it has the collection that we have in the museum is, of course, proclaimed always, as all museums do, as absolutely unique. There's now in Den Bosch a collection from a private collector that's been given or loaned, I think, to the museum. And these kind of collections are I quite like the idea GI, because that used to represent the American soldier coming in to fight National Socialism, to fight Nazism in the 1940s. It originally has a complicated origin, but it kind of stands for general issue or government issue. It actually originally stood for galvanized iron, but then it got changed in that process. It's kind of an interesting word. But this sort of origin in the Second World War seems important to me. But it's a sort of standard issue collection in the sense that if you look at the collections of, say, museums in the Netherlands, but you can go wider, in the period from 1945 to at least 2000, I would say, and also you could say beyond it, there are certain artists that are represented in almost all collections. So it's rather like postage stamp collecting, you could say. Yeah? There are certain stamps that are really valuable and you need to have in your collection. I just list a few there. You could put many more, of course. But there was a kind of a progress in the collection. Again, progress, linear development, yeah? Through Cubism to Cobra minimalism, video art. Then it gets a little bit more confusing, but I think that's part of the desire, I think, of art history, certainly modern art history, is to try and see its task as sorting out the let's say post-1980s art history so that we can continue that line more clearly. What it does, there was a nice drawing in the Tate a long time ago where they basically developed the drawing that I'll refer to in a minute by Alfred Barr. And by the 1980s, they simply had no more movements anymore. So what they got to was simply brand names of artists. So you had Jeff Koons, or you had Paul McCarthy, or you had Damien Hirst, but they were just individuals. And there was no possibility at that time, and maybe not still, to bring them together. But also you see I'm mentioning three men already, yeah? 3 white men, it's not a coincidence. This is where that line leads to. It's not that that line is drawn in retrospect, it's also there in order to project forward and to say these are the people that can be included. On the basis always, of course, of quality and neutrality. But the quality and neutrality is biased in certain directions because the line has already been drawn. So if you draw a line in that direction, it's hard to go there. Yeah? You have to continue it. So these lines are drawn in order to satisfy an argument. And that's where I think the idea of a standard issue collection comes from, because the standard issue is the thing that satisfies the argument. And of course, it's circular. The best artists are these artists because they're in the collection, which means the collection is the best collection. Yeah? So this circle is complete in that way. And also, and this is true of the new building, I mentioned it already, essentially the spaces are piles of white cubes. Again, with this idea that the white cube is, much like the collection, much like the Cold War definition, a kind of free space, autonomous space, in which there is no context beyond the context that the artist brings. And this idea that whiteness, that a geometric space, a cube, has no agenda, has no ideology, but is empty, clean. And, empty, clean, what does that, if we project that onto the land, yeah? Onto the dirt of the earth, yeah? Empty and clean is an incredibly violent act to the earth. Talking about what Rolando was. So this violence is then extracted from this space, and then the empty, clean, pure space is created in which the artist can do their thing. And the remarkableness is that some of these arguments have come from the 1970s onwards against the white cube, against these ideas of context. Much of what I'm saying now is not really grounded even in decoloniality and what Rolando is saying. It's grounded in critiques from much earlier about this. But still, in 2003, and I think in 2013, and still today, the building of the amassing of piles of white cubes is still going on. So this critique has not had any effect because what's the proposition of what comes instead of the white cube? If it's simply a critique, then the architects and the museum directors turn around and say, yeah, but what do you want? And if there's no answer to that, they say, oh, well, we'll build a white cube because that's kind of the thing we know how to build. Yeah? So again, it's how criticality then reduces the possibility of something emerging because the focus remains on how bad this is and not what might emerge. And there's also a fear in that, no? And this is where practice is always more disappointing than theory, because once you start making propositions within practice, then you see the failures in them. So we have to, in a sense, be to a certain extent, a little bit braver in failing in order to allow that kind of dead end, that cul-de-sac of we don't want the white cube, but we don't know what we do want, so we'll get the white cube, of that to be broken. And I think that's true not only of the white cube, but of many things. That's where the stasis that we were in for a long time, and I think, are only starting to emerge from it. And as I say, decoloniality is the only thing that I know that can take us there at the moment. There might be other theories that emerge. It's not to make that exclusive. It's simply to say that it has the force that I don't identify with anywhere else. So what I want to talk about a little bit is the steps that we've taken as a museum, the sort of practical steps in a way, the case studies, if you like, towards this question of decolonizing. And here I would also use the references that Rolando made to positionality and relationality, which I think are two important ways. I would also say there's another aspect, which is, in a way, the glossary, the idea that we need to use the same words but differently, and we need to find new words in order to explain this, because otherwise we get stuck in a certain modernist vocabulary. So positionality, relationality, and also working on a glossary, working on a common sense of what we might mean by certain words, like modernity, that we can agree on. And we have to battle about the agreement, but the agreement should be made in order for us to move on. And so that I think is part of also what we've been doing. So this was a video, but I think I'll skip it because we've got enough time. But it was just a film by Rabea Murray. It's a very short film. It's called The Old House, and it talks about remembering and forgetting, and the cycle of remembering and forgetting, and remembering in order to forget, and forgetting in order to remember. how important, and it's a nice film. Maybe we can play it at the end if people are interested, because it's a nice film in I think, sort of asserting an idea of earth thinking or ancestral thinking as a means of also generating new possibility, or generating possibility. It doesn't have to be new. Nothing has to be new. Yeah? The innovation is out. Yeah, that's the vocabulary we need to retire, in a way. But the generating possibility through an acknowledgement that by remembering, you're also making sure that you've forgotten. At one point, as he says. Yeah? So you remember in order to forget, and forget in order to remember, and that you can rewrite it. And this text here, which I really like, because it's the tone of voice I think that we should have. Yeah? That every sentence in a way should be preceded by this. Perhaps, maybe it's possible. I'm not sure, but it seems that probably. But anyway, we might go back to that. So this is the museum. And it's opened in 1936, as I said, but where did this museum come from? So if we're to remember ourselves and to situate ourselves, we have to be much more specific about who we are. So this is talking a little bit about who we are and how we can react to it. So Van Abbe Museum begins here in a cigar, you had the old cigars, not cigarettes, a cigar factory, which opened in Eindhoven in 1915. It opened previously in Brabant in 1908 and moved from Amsterdam because the wages were cheaper and the unions in Amsterdam were starting to organize themselves and demanding better rights. And down here in the south, that wasn't actually something that was so much of a problem. So the move there was done in a way as a sort of labor-breaking exercise as well, and was moved here in 1915. We didn't open until 1936, so you have 20 years or more of presence in Eindhoven before the museum, when he's building up the collection. Now, cigars are made of tobacco. So already you're starting to see a particular reliance that the museum has on a particular colonial history. So let's go through that. This is drying tobacco warehouse in the 1930s in the Dutch East Indies, which was one of the main productive colonies, along with Suriname, of the Dutch Empire, the pre-Second World War Dutch Empire. So you can say that these people here, and it's an interesting image because the men are looking on and the women are working, which is maybe not atypical of society, that here is an image of our founders as much as it is Henri van Abbe, because without their labor, without the exploitation, extraction from the plantations, from an introduced crop, tobacco is not native to Indonesia, an introduced crop introduced from America, Suriname, so the movement, this logistical movement that Rolando was talking a little bit about, that the colonial system relied upon, this logistical movement produces this kind of image and these kind of people working there. Now, I'll come back to the conditions on the plantation in a minute. But also, this is Henri van Abbe here. I should do it on here, shouldn't I? Sorry. So this is Henri van Abbe here. And this is in the factory in Eindhoven. Again, men looking on largely and women working. So again, these are our founders in some way. And one thing is to start thinking about the name, and we're working with the group thinking around whether the name should have an addition, whether in some sense this level of work should be recognized in the name rather than the honor all going to Van Abbe. But at the same time, in a sense, I would argue we need the relation to Van Abbe in order to tell this story at all, because otherwise it becomes arbitrary. So we need to both keep it and also question it and unpack it. Again, this sort of layering that's happening. So this is important to acknowledge. And then just to give you an example of a number of projects, this is a project that's currently in the museum. And this is a development. So in the background there is Henri van Abbe himself, a portrait. And here on this wall is the beginnings of an attempt to tell the history of the plantation. And what we see in this image, if you come to the museum, you'll be able to see it. But it's essentially the treatment of the workers, the rights that, or the rights that were denied to the workers, the essential continuation of a kind of form of slavery called bonded work, or contract workers. There's even a nice advertisement there of somebody who's weggelopen in Dutch, which is escaped and wants to come back in the 1880s, so after slavery is done away with, but essentially a kind of advertisement for trying to recapture a contract worker, or coolie, as they were called, these awful words that are full of sort of racial discrimination and racial hierarchy in them. And the position of women in here was even worse, because often there were no women that were working in the factories in the beginning. So they were brought into the plantations at a certain point. Later they worked, like in the 1930s, the image you saw. In the beginning they weren't really working there, and they were brought in and were not given any beds, so they would have to find a partner in order to be able to sleep during the night. So they were basically sort of forced into a kind of prostitution in a way through the system of bonded labor that was included here. So that whole process and the information that we've got here comes entirely at the moment from Dutch sources. Because it's important to know that already at the beginning of the 20th century, in 1902, there are cartoons in the paper about the mistreatment of people in Delhi in Sumatra, which is where these are coming from, more than 100 years ago. There's a full knowledge of this. This idea that we did not know, often the claim of people after they discover that some crime has been committed in this sense, is absolutely nonsense, and it's possible to demonstrate that. So, but these are entirely coming from imperial sources based here at the moment, because the legacies, we need more time and resources, and that's what we're spending now in the next year or 18 months to try and get the stories of the plantation from Sumatra, from the people who were the victims of this system, but also to understand what happened to this plantation system afterwards. Because one of the differences, I think, between post-colonialism and decolonialism is that post-colonialism is a kind of description of a condition. And often you can see there's a nice quote, the Declaration of Independence of Indonesia is a very, very short one paragraph thing. And at one point it says the transfer of power and other things will be organized as immediately as possible. And this idea of the transfer of power and other things really stuck. I did an exhibition some time ago, because essentially what happened was the transfer of power happened, but the other things never did. and so this continuity of a system of plantations, which can be seen today, it's palm oil now rather than tobacco, because we don't smoke cigars, but we eat margarine and things like that, and all the things that go into palm oil. But so there's been a switch in the product, but essentially that system more or less remained intact. And that's a system which, of course, is not told under a sort of an idea of focusing on the colonial relationship. It becomes our burden with the name of Van Abbe to find out, to investigate this story, and to tell it in the museum. Not only for that time in the past, when things happen, but out of that time in the past. Looking at the sort of ancestral knowledge, if you like, of the museum itself, comes a whole task emerging about how do we think about the plantations today. And of course then the question emerges, what do we do about that knowledge that we have? What kind of epistemic restitution can we think about? Does it mean that a branch of the Van Abbe Museum should end up in Delhi, or Medan in Sumatra? I don't know, but I think you could think about it at least. Yeah, if it doesn't mean that, does it mean what kinds of relationships need to go with the ancestors of the people who are working here? So suddenly, if you like, through this ancestral approach of the institution itself, suddenly gives you a task. Talking about this idea of what do you do with this knowledge. Suddenly the museum has a task, which we're doing completely inadequately at the moment. I absolutely admit that. But nevertheless, through the research that's been conducted up to this point and getting to this stage, was already this information is all available, but also not ordered in the way that an art history is ordered, where you want to know what was happening with Cubism. Yeah? You can go to a couple of books and you basically have all the story. With this, you have to go back to the original archives and you have to look at them in a certain way. You have to interrogate them with this interest. Because this story was never told in the museum. Because the GI issue, the standard issue collection and the story of the Cold War didn't have room for these. So it's only through the decolonial gaze, through looking decolonially, that we can come to a point where we see this as important. And what's also interesting is that in some ways we cease to be a museum of modern and contemporary art when we're showing this. Because this is more like a social history project. And it's being led not so much by artists, though it would be interesting to involve artists from Delhi in the longer term, but it's being led by a sort of curatorial voice, like a social history museum, that feels that this is important information. So those points that I mentioned earlier are kind of all undone, are untied, and the interconnection between them by this project. And ultimately, of course, a white cube is meaningless in relationship to this project because it's all about context. It's all about the history of a particular moment. It doesn't make sense to put this into a white cube which has no context and you simply work in and visually take account of it. That makes no sense whatsoever. So there's a lot of text on the wall, too much text. I think we can also make it better. And the design is problematic, and I think there are lots of things that need improvement in this. Yeah, this is where the practice is always disappointing at the same time. But nevertheless, it's very important that this is there and present in the museum. This is another image just to give you some ideas of the exhibition. And then this image is important because another kind of way of positioning us and understanding who we are, the positionality that Rolando talked about, is by understanding the history that was blotted out. So when I started in the museum in 2005, as I said, I was the fifth director of the museum. That was what I was told. My task was, given to me by the City Council, was to open a fifth chapter, because there had been 4 chapters led by previous directors, and to open a 5th chapter. I think that's quite normal. Right? I'm the 7th director. There were 2 directors in the Second World War who had been completely eliminated from the account, including a convinced National Socialist who was, in a certain academic sense, a really interesting cultural figure, actually, who took the ideology seriously and tried to implement it. But these images were not in the museum. These images were images we had to research and dig up. A colleague of mine, Evelyn Schevinger, did it. But these are images which appear as if from nowhere in the museum because the narrative was not continued. The narrative story was not kept. So now we in a way revive the National Socialist director. Yeah, we give him a place in our history, which is a little bit perverse, if you think this is the decolonizing is giving somebody like that a place. But this is exactly the histories that need to be recognized in order to understand who we are. Because without understanding that, and even the works that were bought during that period, works in the collection, which were bought during the Second World War, and also changes to the naming of works, we believe. Yeah, we're not certain, but works were changed. We have a portrait of a boxer, Kid Oliveira from Portugal, who's a black person from the Portuguese colonies who lived in Brussels, also lived in and fought in boxed in the Netherlands, and was also a model for a number of artists. And that portrait was changed its name to the N-word at a certain point, and most likely during this period where you wanted then to shape a new narrative. And then it was changed, actually not back, but to another name, and then another name. And this is one of the stories that we tell in the museum. So it's fascinating that this image has, when you go back into the past, it has suddenly a whole new life through these changes of the name, simply the name of the portrait itself, through different curatorial positions that were represented in it, let alone the figure himself. Another image that we have in the collection now of a Javanese dancer who for years was simply a Javanese dancer until somebody came through when we were starting to talk about Indonesia and said, but you know who that is. That's Raden Mas Jojono. And he was a aristocrat who came over to the Netherlands and was one of the people that first integrated Javanese styles of dancing with a kind of Western model in order to make it palatable to Western taste, also with gamelan music and things like that. So suddenly this person that springs into life. But that question had never been really issued before, because again, modern and contemporary art wasn't really engaged in that. Those works are from the Van Abbe collection itself, from this, as I said, if you want to put it in the corner, bourgeois collection, but it actually now for us with those stories has another kind of interest, again through decolonizing. So that's one aspect of coming to terms with the truth of the past, coming to terms with the past of the museum and telling it, not making a judgment about it, not saying this was really bad and we should do it differently, but simply saying this is where we come from. Another aspect of where we come from would be something like this museum index project that we did for a long time, up until recently, where we looked at the collection and tried to analyze it in different ways, cut and describe it through different information design elements, I suppose, but also through asking specific questions. And so one of these questions was, what is the relationship between our collection and the population in Eindhoven in terms of their geographic origins, in terms of the connections that they felt? And so this image here of the two, the grey one is the birthplace of artists in the collection, and the red is the birthplace of people registered living in Eindhoven in 2018. And what you see here is, this is the image of Eindhoven, and this is the image of the collection of the museum. Now, what's really interesting is that one of the narratives that the Van Abbemuseum tells itself and tells the people is that we are an international collection in a provincial city. Yeah, but this shows the opposite. And yet, within the lens of the Cold War discourse, of this avant-garde modernist construction of what art is, then most of this map simply didn't register. What happens to most of this map is the works that were made there by artists, or whatever you want to call them, because there are different terms and different understandings, they end up in ethnographic museums. Museums of world cultures now. We have them in the Netherlands. They used to be called colonial museums. There was a very rigid line between artists who would be allowed into a modern and contemporary art museum, indeed any art museum, and those that were consigned to another place. And it's interesting, when the cuts came in 2011, heavily in the Netherlands on culture, by the current government, the current prime minister, the people who are still in control, have never apologized for it. When the cuts came for this, they targeted more than anything else the ethnographic museums. There were independent museums in different parts of the Netherlands which were brought under one umbrella in order to cut the costs for those ethnographic museums. Because, just like 1945, or 1940 to 45, they wanted, in a way, there was a sense of guilt, a sense, the colonial thing wasn't very good. We changed the name from Colonial Museum to Tropical Museum. We've done these things to try and sort of massage away this past, but actually, wouldn't it just be better if we forgot it? If we buried it under the table and look forward, look to the future. Yeah, what new business relations can we have with Indonesia? Not what do we do with this stuff? They even sold a lot of books and archives, which were in the colonial library, which became the tropical library, if you like. In order to, I don't know. I don't think they even sold them for very much. It was simply an act of despoliation, of destitution of the archive, in order to remove the possibility that these might later become analyzed. And there might later be a new sense of guilt that might emerge. Yeah? That's at least my theory. Of course, that's not, they don't say, we feel really guilty, so we want to push it under the carpet. They don't say it. They say, logics of efficiency, the logics of collection, the logics of capital dictate that we do this. It's funny that they targeted that more so than the Rijksmuseum, or more so than the art museums like us. We were also cut, but not to the same degree. So this story here is very much alive. Yeah? This was 2011. Okay, it's 10 years ago, but it's the same government that's in power. There's not much difference. So these are the stories that you're battling against. Once you see this, you say, well, actually, our collection is quite impoverished. Yeah? This is a word that Rolando didn't use yesterday, but he uses it quite a lot, and I really like it. It's that modernity impoverished our experience, our lived experience. And because it put our lived experience into boxes and said some things are valid and can be instrumentalized for your career or for your understanding of yourself, and other things need to be discarded, needs to be got rid of. So it's an impoverishment of the richness that you might have as an experience of something. That's how modernity dealt with information, with data. It reduced it. And it's reduction, which is something also that's at the heart often of a sort of instruction for you as artists, to reduce to get to the essence. Now, there are some reasons to think about that, but there are also reasons to resist it as well. So that idea of reducing also was an impoverishment of the global map. Yeah? This is an impoverishment of a map, and I wish we'd had a better projection of the Earth than this one. I always struggle with that, but we would do when we do it again. But nevertheless, there's a sort of impoverishment when it's only these little dark areas that are really properly represented, and then you claim a sort of internationalism through it. This is another example. These are two examples of the division, and I think now, again, thinking about it more recently, this is from 2017, we might question the sort of binariness of this. Yeah? But we have 3 lines, male, female, and group. And this is the collection, also divided by years. You can see an earlier version, which was from 2012, I think, where you see that the male line actually goes on off the page. It continues to go on. These are the female artists. These are the artist collectives. So just on this binary division, which you can question, but is also, still for a lot of certainly historical work, is fairly clear and easy to define. For this collection, then, you see how impossible an idea of sort of catching up with that past would be. Sorry, that the process of catching up would take as long as the museum has been open. So therefore, you need to think about other notions of how to compensate for a collection which is so dominantly male. And if we did it in terms of ethnicities and things like that, it would be even more problematic. But again, to recognize this, like in recognizing the past, is also to start to approach the limitations of the modern, and then to ask a question about what do we do? Not necessarily that there needs to be an answer. It's not about a question and answer session for society. Huh? It's about these things, these images hovering in the background and making a certain consciousness of not repeating this, at least now. Huh? It was a nice statement that an Australian Aboriginal artist made when sort of confronted with this idea of guilt, of white guilt, as opposed to white innocence. And he said, we know that your grandfather was busy shooting us for sport. Yeah? But all we're asking really is for you to recognize that that happened and to not do it yourself. Yeah? If you change your action because of what happened in the past, you don't need to feel guilty, but you need to change your action. And that I found, a sort of, as a white body that bears those responsibilities, that kind of was a notion of, okay, so we need to say that this happened, and we need to not hide it, but we also need to try and behave today in a different way, and to take account of it, which is what we do. But I can talk about that later. How much longer do I have?
As you wish, but it's much more about your energy.
Oh, it's okay. I can go on.
Now,
I can talk.
An hour and 10 minutes. So.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll do. Yeah. I'll do a little bit more.
There you go.
Okay, I'm happy to do so. So we've remembered the museum and kind of located it. Yeah, the sort of positionality of the museum is part of what we're doing. Now that's inadequate. All these things are inadequate. Yeah, there is always more that you can do. Certainly the research into Indonesia has only just really begun, and we've been at it for 4 years. But even in that time, the resources that we've given to it as well have been inadequate and things like that. There's lots of issues why we haven't got as far, but also it does take time. These things, coming to terms with a different notion of time and not futurity is something which within an organization and changing the orientation of your colleagues and things like that takes a lot. When you say, we don't really need a sort of curatorial knowledge which is grounded on Frieze Art Fair anymore. That's actually not that useful for us. That takes away a whole body of knowledge from curators. And they're presumed, the presumption of what they and I should be busy with. Yeah? We should be concerned about Basel Art Fair and who's sold and who's not sold and who's coming up and who's more avant-garde than the other person and things like that. Those are the things that we're concerned about. So you have to relearn. Yeah, it's a relearning process. It's a listening process and a relearning process, which is internally orientated to what kind of information do we need. That's why it took us more time than it should have to really uncover our Indonesian or Dutch East Indies connections and roots, because it was like you use a limb that you haven't used for ages. Huh? It's like, but we've always been doing this and it's been fine and everyone's been happy with it, so why are you asking us to do this? Well, no, let's keep on doing that. And there's a struggle then in the body, yeah? In the body politic to keep on doing that anyway. And say, okay, well, maybe we can do a bit like that. And you say, no, stop. But if we stop doing that, then what happens? Yeah? Then the whole thing collapses. And our responsibility is to keep the institution going to a certain extent, yeah, at least understood. I mean, I think, you know, as we go through this transition, that's going to become more and more a question. Is the responsibility of the institution to keep itself alive? Or is the relationship to life another one? But that's for the future. But okay, that's about anchoring ourselves in the present, and also to some extent in Eindhoven, as you see with the factory. But there's also the anchor that we have, the justification, the self-identity that the museum has with modern ideology. And so really that modern ideology stems from this. I hope you've all seen this, no, in your art history lessons and things like that, but it's the cover of a book published in 1936, the same year as the museum opened, drawn by Alfred Barr, who was the director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And this is in a way the archetypal and complex. You know, it's not a single straight line. It's interesting. It has a complexity. You know, we need to recognize what's being done here. But this is the definition that he issued in 1936. So you see the map goes up to 1935. Issued in 1936 to explain what the Museum of Modern Art's collection would be. And this was an exhibition called Cubism and Abstract Art, these being the two, non-geometric and geometric abstract art being the two directions which he saw. And again, that becomes predictive. Yeah? You look for those things because you've written into a line that that's where you need to go to. It's it's like a walking direction. Yeah? If you're told to go there, then you have to go along certain paths in order to get there. Those lines lead to certain things. What's really interesting from a sort of decolonial perspective is actually these red boxes. I don't know if you can see it close enough, but these red boxes here talk about, what do they talk about? It's never really fully explained within the discourse, but what they say inside them is Japanese prints, Near Eastern art, Negro sculpture, excuse me for the word, and machine aesthetic. And there's also a black box here, which is modern architecture. Focus on the red boxes for a moment. What you see there in the origin, and there have been other versions of this drawing that have excluded those boxes, that have simply written about modern art as itself. But you see that it was unavoidable at the beginning of constructing the narrative of modern art. It was unavoidable to see that there was an outside which influenced what had happened. It couldn't be denied. This is it's called sort of first generation syndrome in a way. You see that in colonial circles, particularly Australia, because that was the most recent settler colony, where the first generation that arrive, in the accounts that they have, they recognize indigenous culture. But by the second generation, that's gone. The recognition's gone. It's vanished. And in a way, this is in the first generation of modernity, they're recognizing something that sort of connects to something that we don't know quite what to do, so we'll put it in a different color. And we'll put it in a box. But what's interesting about this is what does this represent? What do these boxes represent? Because they're somehow outside of the main narrative. You know, the box extracts them. It's a nice word, no? Extracts them from the main narrative. And what I would say, and this is my interpretation, is it kind of makes them inert material. So rather like the stuff under the ground that we mine, inert material which is there for extraction and exploitation. It's like coal. Because if you are a Japanese printmaker, or an artist from Lebanon, or a sculptor from Congo, how do you put yourself into this? I think the clue is also that machine aesthetic, which is of course a human production, but something that does not have an aesthetic value, it has a functional value, it produces an aesthetic by itself in a way. It produces an aesthetic which is after the fact. That sort of tells us that this is all about a kind of aesthetic production after the fact. That in a way Japanese prints in this diagram only exist as Japanese prints because of modernism. That N-word sculpture only exists because it's on this diagram. Otherwise it wouldn't be sculpture. Otherwise it would be some sort of functional tool, a fetish. So this is sort of fascinating if you start to unpack it, because how can, if this is the diagram, my contention would be that this is the diagram, and I can show diagrams in the 50s in the Van Abbemuseum which follow this and are used convince the city council to buy modern art at the time. Yeah? So it's directly following from this. If this is the blueprint, this is the blueprint for most of the museums in the world. Sometimes I go a bit over the top and say, it's a little bit like a kind of Al-Qaeda structure in which you don't have direct management of all the cells, but somehow each museum around the world is a kind of cell for modern propaganda. And they sort of exist and make their own independent policy as long as they stick to this as a kind of, Sharia blueprint, if you like. And you can interpret it your own, you can add things to it, but nevertheless you have to keep more or less true to this drawing. So that's a little bit absurd now, as a way of thinking, but I think it's true that there was a certain ideological drive that originated the construction of so many modern museums in the post-Second World War period and up until 2008, as we saw, other enlargement. And it was following this. Another element that it was following is the idea of visuality. Yeah, often when we talk about art, certainly visual art, there's an expectation that it should be visual. Yeah? Critics are resistant to the idea that there's a text with it. It should be something which is experienced in the main through the eye. Yeah, and the eye is linked to the brain. Now we can think about the visual as a very privileged sense, a sense which is even in Christian ideology is put above the other senses. There's lots of problems in the sort of hierarchy of senses within Western culture, which go back to Christianity actually, and Judaism. But what's interesting here is that this is a drawing by Herbert Bayer amongst a series of drawings which related to the ideal exhibition. And what I want to point out here is the impoverishment of the human body which is going on in this image, while at the same time it's talking about an enlargement and an increase in the field of vision. And so this is projected as a sort of generous production of a widened horizon, a horizon that goes from top to bottom and not just on a straight line. That's how it's presented. Huh? But what actually happens is you look at this figure here, and if this is the ideal exhibition, then it's hard not to see this as the ideal viewer. So our museums are built, if we follow this logic of the establishment in the 1930s of this ideology, of course after the art is painted in many cases, or produced. Yeah? So it's not necessarily part of the art, it's part of the narrative that's produced about the work. It's part of that diagram I showed you. And in that, this sort of ideal visitor is conjured up. So what this means is that museums, following the ideological patterning of Alfred Barr and the Museum of Modern Art, helped, of course, by the victory in the Second World War, etc., and the need, particularly in Western Europe, to forget about the war and to turn to America as a kind of ethical salvation, in a certain sense. Yeah, it's another story that we can go into. But the reason that developed as the pattern means, or not the fact that it developed as the pattern, means that these figures become the desired visitor for the museum. Now, when we talked about the relationship between the Eindhoven population and the museum, we already see that there's a discrepancy, that there's a gap between them. But look at this figure. I mean, it's in a suit, it's male, we guess. Yeah? It's got an eye for a head. All the other senses are removed, are excluded. So for this figure, the white cube might make total sense. Because you can't talk in the museum, so be silent. And you can't hear anything, so there shouldn't be any sound. And you can't really touch things. You've got one hand, but it's a hand which is sort of addressed to the eye, yeah? Which is addressed to thinking, but not to expressing, not to feeling. And so these other senses are removed from this male figure, yeah? Male European figure, yeah? It's European dress. So all those elements are then go into this. So it's not a coincidence, it's this figure that's presented. And my contention would be that actually, for a long time, museums were making exhibitions claiming to be working for the artist or working to increase the idea of to increase the acceptance of the ideology of the modern within society. You know, this idea of a sort of civilizational responsibility to tell people this is good art and this will make you a better person. But they were making them to some extent unconsciously, for that figure. And if they were making them for that figure, that's not a figure that exists. And if it did exist, it would be horrific. So we're making it for a completely fictional idea of a public. So when museums talk about public, if this is the sort of fiction that we're making it for, and this is in the roots of it, then we need to analyze it and we need to extract that and understand that if we're going to change this figure, we need to do so proactively. It doesn't simply happen by adding on a few senses or whatever, even though that's partly what we're trying to do. It actually starts by recognizing this figure as the figure that's the ideal visitor, and that no longer matches with society. Indeed, it never matched with any human who was ever born. Then we can start to move on. But the recognition needs to be there. This is another diagram by Alfred Barr, which is interesting in itself, but I won't go too long about it. What's interesting about it, maybe most interesting, is a 1941 diagram at the bottom, where you see that the one above, you also see that there's a sort of a body of what we would now call contemporary art, so art that's been produced at the time, which is excluded from the Museum of Modern Art. In other words, not all art is modern art. Yeah, modern art has a particular ideology. And the bottom one, which is done in 1941, so at the moment in the war where it looks like the United States is about to join, perhaps, it looks like Europe is lost to National Socialism, then he sees modern art as exclusively, in its future, being developed in the United States and Mexico. Yeah, so what that means when that story comes back to Europe, and that's what I'm concerned about in a way, because I'm in Eindhoven, it comes back to Europe, it says actually everything that you did is no longer part of the story. Yeah? There was the School of Paris, there was the rest of Europe, you were there, but the Second World War, fine, forget it, there's nothing. So you have to restart it from new, yeah? So Cobra, everything like that, yeah? Falls from this logic that, okay, it ended. The Second World War ended. But there are so many continuities between before and after the Second World War in Europe. You know, what's the first thing that the Dutch government does? Almost the first thing the Dutch government does when it gets its independence, its capacity to move independently from the German government, because it was dependent on German government before. So when it's liberated, as it's called, at that point, one of its first actions is to try and reclaim its colonies in Southeast Asia. Well, we had a great time being occupied. We thought we'd come and do it all to you again. Of course, there was a Japanese occupation and things like that. It's a bit flippant to say that. But nevertheless, that logic, except for the Communist Party, that logic didn't occur to anybody in the political field in the Netherlands in 1945, when the opportunity came. As one of the first ideas, okay, let's go back and take it. Same with the British in Burma and Malaysia. That process was sort of built into this, into the systems that come from the Second World War. So much continuity, and yet here sort of this break is represented. And then you have to listen to the United States and Mexico. And Mexico is a particular kind of Mexico, yeah, well, let's say. But you have, and then the United States is a particular kind of United States. It's the United States of this group here, not the United States of this American painting at the bottom. So that's where the sort of exclusions start. And then through those exclusions, the claim is to autonomy, freedom, avant-garde, international. Yeah? And there's no apparent contradiction in that, at that moment. Yeah, so there are exhibitions that are called extremely international in reviews in the 1960s. An exhibition called When Ashes Becomes Form gets a review in the Studio International, which calls itself extremely international because it comes from 10 countries in Europe and America, North America. So, that's how a kind of a mythology is born. Yeah, it's how it's built up, and it comes back. So, linking ourselves back to these pasts as well as to the past of the museum, and understanding what we need to do about that, which is an open question, of course, is very important. So I want to take you through a couple of projects now, just so that you can see the museum and some of the ones that are not for show anymore. So. One is a collection display, which is what's called The Making of Modern Art, and opened in 2017 and closed this year, 21. So it was for 4 years, was displayed. And here, really, a lot of the story that I've told you is told in an exhibition form. Other things are told as well, but this is the entry point. And what you see here is an image of Alfred Barr. An image of Alfred Barr here. And the diagram is actually here. And here is an alternative narrative, in a way, a narrative with a longer history. So not an idea that modern art is an exception and begins in the 1880s with Van Gogh, but more that it's something that goes back to a previous set of artists by Alexander Dorner, who was in Hanover. And in a way, you could see these two male directors are sort of struggling for the description of modern art, which is ultimately won by Alfred Barr because of the victory in the Second World War, largely. And Dorner is isolated. But this through this image, and this is put together in a actually the artist is from Kosovo, who's the janitor, as he calls it, of the Museum of American Art Berlin, and he put it together. I mean, this was sort of all collective decisions in a way, inside a sort of room that reminds him of his Kosovan origins. Yeah, so a sort of Turkish divan type room. So you're looking through this room in a contemporary towards this history through the window. And so again, rewriting those histories, recovering those histories, looking at another time with the distance of the display. And I'll go quickly through. Oh, why doesn't it go on now? Yeah, so this is people looking at it, sort of propagandizing for the kids. And then in the exhibition in itself, we played with ideas of what is modern. So this sculpture, Maria sculpture, for instance, which comes from a local collection, comes from a local church, which, within the context of a museum, when it's taken out, is no longer something that you pray in front of. So you can talk and describe about how objects, given their context, have a completely different role. Yeah? No longer becomes a holy or a sacred object. A Mondrian and two Mondrians next to each other, one of which is a copy of another. So you can talk about copy and original and what the differences might be between that. And a project with Solowit where we made copies of the Solowit with a group called Superflex and then distributed them for free. So we actually set up a workshop in the museum, making the copy and then distributing them for free, using Solowit's sentences on conceptualism, where he would say that it's not the materialization of the work that counts, but it's the idea. So if that's true, then the idea remains his. And we got permission from the estate in the end. They were very sort of clear. It was a nice conversation where they said, but you should put a sticker saying it's a Superflex artwork and not a Solowit. We said, yeah, but there's nothing on the original to say it's a Solowit artwork. It's only a certificate with it. So they said, oh yeah, of course. So yeah, so just have a certificate with it and then it's fine. Just saying that it's not a Solowit and then it would be fine. So we have a whole series of these, and there are also a whole series of them around the world. Yeah, it's not a Solowit. Yeah, that's what it said. Yeah. So yeah, and then looking at this, which we were talking about, this influence and division between ethnographic and modern art museums. And this is actually a picture here of Henry van Abbe tasting the tobacco in the warehouse in Amsterdam, because he wasn't running plantations directly. They were a bit like Unilever do now. They sort of create companies that run the plantations, the palm oil plantations, and then they say, oh, but our hands are clean. We're actually not involved in it, but they're buying all the products from those places. So in a similar way, you could say Henry van Abbe was buying the tobacco that was shipped into Amsterdam from Indonesia rather than directly running the plantations. So this is a sculpture from Sumatra, from a dance ritual from Sumatra, which we borrowed from the Museum of World Cultures, and then including different modernist narratives that might shake up the history a little bit. So this is Peggy Guggenheim, 3 women patrons basically who were fundamental. Gertrude Stein. That were sort of fundamental to the construction of the pre-Second World War, or the possibilities in a way of a pre-Second World War modernism to arise, but through patronage, through support of the artists, through sales. Kathleen Dreyer is the third one who was supportive of Marcel Duchamp. So they all had their own artists in a way, and these women, these strong women with their own money, often through family or through marriage, but with their own money, were actually the driving force in many ways, and then get to some extent, you could say, not exactly written out, they're still known about. Catherine Dreyer is known about. Peggy Guggenheim, of course, has left her name on many things. But nevertheless, the narratives centering around Alfred Barr and Alexander Dorner are somehow turned around a little bit, at least in terms of gender politics, through this part of the displays. And then finally, a room which is a re-enactment, in a way, of a proposal for Alexander Dorner for Hanover by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, a proposal which was never built because of the arrival of National Socialist government in Hanover, actually earlier than the National Socialist government in Berlin, and therefore was never built. Next to Abstraktes Kabinett, if you know, which was built by Lissitzky, there was a plan for Moholy-Nagy to make the room of the contemporary. Interesting when we talk about the contemporary now, yeah? So it was already in 1930 this idea that the contemporary would be different, because this room consisted entirely of media. So photography, dia projection, 16mm film projection, and also a moving sculpture by Moholy-Nagy himself. The light space, lichtraummodulator, the light space modulator. And that these works were put into this environment, and then obviously the images could be changed and things like that, could be updated. But this was a sort of another way of displaying contemporaneity that wasn't the white cube. Huh? So again, when you go back into these histories, you start to see how the white cube's dominance has not necessarily the approval, in a way, of the artists themselves, but comes much more through an institutional agenda and perhaps even a commercial agenda. You know, it's easier, in simple terms, it's easier to imagine the painting above your sofa in your home if the room is white and there's no context for it, because then you can say, oh, I can just buy that and put it in there. So for galleries, for the commercial reasons, then the white cube serves quite a good purpose to allow the potential collector, potential buyer, to project themselves with that painting, rather than feel as though, oh, if I want to have this, I need to buy the whole thing. Yeah, I need to buy the whole context. So now, oh no, if I just buy the painting, I get it all. So there's an element of commercial imperative in the white cube, but also simply the easiness of it in relationship to architecture. This kind of demands a different sort of engagement, because if every room had to be like this and you had to ask artists to design it, then there'd be a whole other set of tasks, in a way, that you as artists and designers would have. Yeah? But because you could just reproduce the white cube more or less infinitely in different configurations, then it's far easier for architects to take control of that process. So lots of reasons why these things happen, yeah? But also it's interesting because we're talking a lot about copies and what and if a copy exists, and to what extent does it then negate the original, or does it add to the value of the original? Then this is an interesting work because it's a copy without an original. Yeah? So it's a copy of a plan that was never carried out at the time. So those are some of the aspects that we've looked at to try to come to terms with this ideology and in a way humble the modernity. I think there's a lot of sort of humbling going on here, also in terms of the way that some of these works are displayed. There are sort of originals and copies that are mixed in here. And in that sense, it's also a kind of humbling of the idea of the DNA of the artist, of the individual genius, of the notion that there's something unique about this product, but more that this product is part of a narrative, and it's a narrative that we want to tell rather than uniqueness of the object. Huh? It's the context rather than the individual instance. And then a step 2 towards decolonizing would be to make a more epistemological and aesthetic shift. That is painful, and it's something that we're going through at the moment. So decoloniality asks us not only to go into the archives, of course, but it's important because as a result of that, and that's what we often term demodernizing, to demodernize the collection is to take out this ideology and examine it for what it is. But also demodernizing, once you've examined it, you see the blind spots. You see what is no longer sustainable in that modernist narrative. and therefore you start to demodernize it. Yeah? And demodernization is not, in any sense, anti-technological. Yeah, I think this is also the same as Rolando, this danger that you then end up in an idea, so you want to go back to medieval Europe or something like that. Yeah? I mean, there's some things to be said for the plurality of medieval Europe as opposed to the singularity of modern Europe, absolutely. You know, the nation states being a singular model for how we organize ourselves against the sort of plurality of states in the medieval period, just as one example of plurality. So there are lessons to be learned from that period for sure, but in technological terms, it's not necessary. I think the Rolando made an important distinction between technology and tool. And tools are things to be used by us in order to achieve ends which we predetermine. Yeah? So you take a hammer, and it can be a weapon, or it can be something to build a bookcase. And you're determining the use of that tool because of the end which you want to achieve. And technology is in a way determining you in a certain sense. Yeah? We could also say that technology is basically tool. It's only that our understanding of technology when we use it is much more deterministic than the idea of the tool. So it's really adapting to the current use of those terms, rather than if you look at the origin of technology, then you could see in it essentially the idea of tool being very present in the word. But I don't think we can rescue technology as tool. We have to have another word to say that if social media is a tool, then what is the goal which we're trying to achieve? And I think so often social media creates its own goal. So it becomes a tool that reproduces itself rather than is used for another direction, another result. So the demodernization that we're talking about, I think, you know, the making of modern art is a demodern exhibition, is important to understand as wanting to reassert the idea of art to some extent as a tool. And this is maybe what we'll sort of end up a little bit on, because this is an exhibition that we did in 2013, which I think was the start of some of this thinking and beginning to decolonize ourselves in a certain sense, although we probably wouldn't have used that word at the time. But this is the introduction of a term that Tania Bruguera invented in a way, which was arte útil. That's why it's in Spanish, because she invented it. But also it's useful that it's in Spanish because the idea of useful art, which you might translate it as, is inadequate to this translation, because útil is like utensil in English. It has this idea of the tool in it. Yeah? So this is really the Museum of Art as a tool. And this is partly what we did, but also how we've continued with working with it. So there were projects like an honest shop. There was an exhibition in the old building of the museum where we basically built an archive of initially around 250 projects. Now it's nearer to 800 projects, which could be defined as arte útil. And I'll tell you what the definition of arte útil that we arrived at is in a minute. And then from those projects, we chose about 15, which we could reenact in a way within the museum, historical projects that could be reenacted within the museum as examples of it. So this is an honest shop which takes local production, so from jams to local jewelry you can see here, and then sells it in the museum, but without a casa, so people would just write down their own names. It's a project that existed in England for a time, has other antecedents, about this idea of the honest shop, but it's an artistic project proposed by an artistic community, Grisdale Arts, and was played out here. Here's a light therapy room by Apollonia Sustercic, which is a sort of taken from the Scandinavian climes where vitamin D is inadequate during the winter, so you can go into a room where you can top up on vitamin D. But then this was used as a sort of meeting room, and also the businesses that we have contact with in the city council and things like that used it as a meeting room. And through that, what we heard anecdotally is that because of coming into a museum and because of this process and the lighting and things, there were different kinds of conversations that emerged. Yeah? The architecture resulted in a different kind of encounter, a different kind of relationality. We're getting towards relationality that existed here. This is a press, a publisher called Lumpanix, who published the titles that you can see there and many more. And we had a photocopier. It was from 2013, so I guess that was still the technology then, that you could copy the books and basically take them away. Lumpanix went bankrupt later on, so that's possibly not unconnected to the fact that they were doing this. But this is from a group in Rotterdam called Bic van der Pol. And again, this idea that it was a kind of a useful project, because all of these are how-to books. in a sense, in how to develop things. And this is the platform artutil.org that you might go to. And this just to outline the sort of criteria that we developed to think about projects, actually ultimately which go back to the middle of the 19th century, John Ruskin and people like that. These are the criteria that we use to determine whether an artistic project is artutil or not. And they were developed collectively by a group of us, led by Tanya largely. So propose new uses for art within society, use artistic thinking to challenge the field within it which it operates, respond to current urgencies, operate on a one-to-one scale. In other words, the shop is a real shop, it's not a model, you can actually go and buy things there. Replace authors with initiators and spectators with users. This comes also from Stephen Wright, who's somebody who's written quite a lot around the idea of usership, is worthwhile tracking down. Have practical beneficial outcomes for its users. So there's a sort of ethical agenda written into the work. Pursue sustainability, that's become much more important in the intervening 8 years. And re-establish aesthetics as a system of transformation, which I think was an interesting one that we added. So how does the aesthetic have the possibility to help us with the transition? I think transformation now I'm more resistant to, like revolution, but transition is a word that I feel happy with at the moment. I'll probably be unhappy with it in a few weeks, but at the moment I'm happy with it. But this idea of transitioning is something that I think aesthetics could be a tool in which that process could move us from one position to another. And that transitioning is then saying that where we are now, and the task that we have as a museum is not to maintain what we have now, but actually to try and transition to another now, to another set of possibilities and definitions, which deal with this history that we have and have some way of responding to them, propositionally. The transition, that's why I like the word, the transition implies a proposition. Not necessarily a destination, but a proposition. You live in the transition. You're not saying we're transitioning and we know where we're going to. It comes also from me a lot with more recent projects I've been working on, which I'll talk a little bit at the end, in agriculture here, but also in Australia and Indonesia, where a lot of times people, farmers, everybody involved in that, will talk about the agricultural transition, away from methane, from nitrogen production, away from unsustainable use of land and things like that, towards something else. But that towards is not really defined. The transition is itself something. Then in the temporary programs, I think this is exhibition of Rashid Areen. This you can see on the website actually, and it's not so interesting. But within the temporary program, which is kind of the easiest thing for the museum to change, it goes through the temporary program, which you can easily change. And I think a lot of museums are now doing the right thing with temporary programs. That's important. The next level is really the collection, because that's longer term, and it's also writing in a new narrative. Then there's the staff. So the question of how issues of diversity, inclusion, but also of who is able to speak, who is able to enunciate themselves, and who is able to listen, and who takes time to listen. Listening being important in that process. So who is it that's decided? And that's not only the staff that are permanently employed, but who are the people that are your fellow travelers in a project? Who are the people that are giving advice, and who are the people that are responding and criticizing what's happening? This idea of the autonomous artist was, I think, for a certain time, almost replaced or paralleled with the idea of the autonomous curator. And these things are both problematic. And one of the shifts that we're making is away from the idea of a curator as this sort of autonomous being towards more of an idea of relationality, and how a curator is somebody who builds a kind of constituency, which is not only artists, but also a wider community that can then have a voice in this. And that's how we've done the most recent presentation of the collection. This is an Indigenous Australian artist working with the collection itself. So this is an Anselm Kiefer, for instance. This is a Picasso on its side. Again, playing a bit like we were doing with the Mondrian, again, playing with the sort of question of value and the strategies of display. And this is a diagram of a pattern which is common to his community in Australia. I was going to show a film, but I'll not do that. And then the most recent collection display, the one that you would see now, which is called delinking and relinking. So chimes really with the idea of dwarsverbanden in Dutch, for those who speak Dutch, but delinking and relinking in English. And I hope sort of takes on board a lot of what we've learned, but one of the things that it really addresses, and this you can see here in this touch replica, is the idea of a multisensory and a plurivocal approach to the collection. So multisensory being an acknowledgement that the tools that we might have had for partially sighted or deaf people are tools that can be shared by everybody. So this is there permanently as something to touch, whether you're sighted or not, to start to construct away from that figure of the ideal visitor that we saw before, yeah, with the eye for a head. And at the same time that we start to sort of acknowledge different histories. So this is something that's dear to my thinking in a way. This is bringing together in a circle a series of, in a way, powerful women that sort of represent a similar struggle divided by time. So on one side are models, so the literal idea of the role model translated into the fashion model from the 90s, who were then ascribed names of partisan fighters from Yugoslavia in the Second World War. So to think about the models that were there in the communist time, if you like, in the socialist time in Yugoslavia, and the models that replaced them in the 90s particularly, and how this affected Sanja Ivekovic, who's the artist, how it affected her sense of identity, but also the feminist struggles in Yugoslavia more generally. And then as part of this circle, this is a wider circle, is our three artists, including Gloria Wecker, Philomena Esche, and Ernestine Convalius, who are three of the people that have been most active in the sort of Afro-Dutch struggle for recognition. Here, Gloria Wecker, you heard yesterday, and it's by Patricia Casahan, who's part of that community. And the idea here really is, you know, in a simple juxtaposition, is to bring these two together, to say that the partisan struggle in the Second World War and Gloria and Ernestine and Philomena's struggle today is the same. That actually these are united in this circle, and you know, carried here by women in this case, but of course it could be other kinds of identities that are carrying for it. And this is in the last room, a kind of an end of it. We have a Zadkin sculpture at the beginning, and this is at the end, put together with a work that's in a roundabout way from the Ethnographic Museum. Yeah? So to try, there are a couple of moments where we bring in works that are from the Ethnographic Museum to try and, in a sense, build a little bit of connection in this colonial wound we could talk about in the museum world, which is cut between the museum collection of art and the museum collection of what's called ethnography. So that if you are an artist, in the broadest terms of that word, from a particular region of the world, you will be consigned to one or other of those. And this is an attempt to bring these two together, because they're both essentially done with the same intention. Yeah? They're from a single piece of wood that's cut and shaped in order to allow, in a certain sense, the wood to express itself, but at the same time cut in terms of a human image. And then a few longer-term projects which I think touch on relationality more. One with Jonas Stahl, where we reconstructed, in order to help building it, the parliament space that he designed in Rojava in the north of Syria, in the Kurdish part of Syria, and in the Kurdish revolution process, which is here and which was built. And then we reconstructed it in the parliament itself, and use it as a meeting room. It's still here, you can go and see it. So it becomes a place we can gather under the idea of democratic confederalism, which is Abdullah Öcalan's philosophy. So not a nation state, but an idea of bottom-up governance. Very interesting. And here it can be discussed. So here are sort of young people from school, just left school, who are in debate clubs, who are using this space as a place to debate and try and acknowledge people. And here we see also different meetings taking place. So a kind of space in which relationality is the core. So actually, you know, if you come and see it like this, it's kind of rather pointless in a certain sense. It's what happens when this comes together. And there are other projects like this as well by Sandy and Sandy Hilal and Alessandro Petti, where we bring together migrants from Eindhoven who have been uitgeprocedeerd, that's rejected from the asylum-seeking process, but are not actually put on planes out of the country, but are left in a kind of twilight zone between being legal and not legal. And they're not legal, so they can't earn money officially and things like that. And there we work with them in the museum so that they can host people in a space which Sandy designed, which is here. And so sort of discussions can take place with those people, but also it's a way of directing money, but also of bringing together people that are unlikely to encounter each other in a way, because they're the average museum visitor is not somebody who talks to migrants on the street, but within the safe space in a way of the museum, that encounter can take place. And finally, sorry I've been too long, is a project that I hope maybe we can get involved in together, which is called the Four Soils, or just Soils sometimes. And it's looking at the relation to the earth and the land in 3 locations: in Brabant, which is the next province up from here where Eindhoven is, in Victoria in Australia, and particularly in southeast Australia, Victoria, and in Indonesia, particularly in Sumatra. And so this project is one where we try to work out how the soil affects our understanding, historically what the soil represents, maybe with artists working on the archive, and also what is the sort of processes of transition that artists can engage themselves with. So this question, I think it was asked at the end of Rolando, is sort of a question that's around this project, like what can artworks do in order to build a different kind of effective spiritual, cultural, communal, and dirty hands relationship to the soil itself. And that involves a series of visits to farms at the moment, just really research. This is for 2024. So it might be something, I just talked to Hisham about it this morning, but it might be something that a few of you could be interested in joining us on some of the trips and seeing what this could represent. As an advisor here, I'm speaking now rather than director of the museum, but it could be something where we could, give you an opportunity to see the place that you're in to a certain extent, and the particularities of this place. Because one of the interesting things from the initial meetings we had was that talking to indigenous people in Australia, to people in Indonesia, particularly from non-Javanese communities, and talking to people in the Netherlands, was that in the Netherlands we were never really able to locate ourselves. We always talked either universally or we talked in abstraction. Yeah, so the we was never the we that was defined in the same way by communities in Australia or in Indonesia, and that really got us thinking. Yeah, it was sort of a revelation in a way. Like the West cannot locate itself. Yeah, it doesn't know where it is. It's always trying to struggle. That's of course connected to individuality. Yeah, this idea of individual freedom in which you're not really anything. Yeah, people in the Netherlands would even say they're not really Dutch at a certain level. Yeah, because they're themselves. So this idea of not being connected to the collective, of refusing that connection, is also written into the way that we speak when we encounter those discussions. And so we're trying to learn how to connect to who we are. I've talked a little bit about the history, but the environment of Van Abbe is largely agricultural, and the history of Brabant is largely as an agricultural region. So that's what we're doing now, and it might be interesting for you to join us. Finally. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. We can take some questions if you like. I don't know how long we like. Sorry.
Yeah, I talked a long time, so you're probably all exhausted.
2 hours.
Oh my God, really?
Great. We're all exhausted. I know. Maybe 1 or 2 questions. No. I can ask a question. Yes. Okay. There we go.
Thank you very much. I was interested. I mean, all of the projects that you talked about towards the end. It's really nice to see how kind of ambitious, but also how humble you are in terms of acknowledging that they're not enough or that there's more to do. And I was wondering if you could talk about the tensions or the difficulties that you have as the director of a museum taking these steps in terms of frictions between the institution and other institutions, or funding, or kind of the infrastructure that the institution sits within. What are the tensions that you encounter, or the challenges that you encounter in pushing forward these types of projects, or the journey of decolonizing?
Yeah, and I mean, it's a good question. It's also difficult to answer, no, because then you sort of center yourself very easily, and I don't like to do that, and also, it would be bogus to do it as well. But I think that there are certain rules and and expectations that a modern and contemporary art museum has inscribed into it in statutes. What is the nature of the collection? In the activities that you do, a certain number of exhibitions, a certain money which is available for certain kinds of activities and is controlled. And that's really where you run up against the barriers. It's always, the question of a refusal to do something is always couched in terms of the legal and the instrumental, in the sense that that instrument is not meant for this use. Yeah? So it's very rarely couched in terms of, we don't like you and we're going to censor you. In fact, never. Not that, I mean, yeah, a few right-wing politicians have said that we should be defunded because of what we're doing, but that's also just vainglorious and about populism. You know, they're not really, they probably even wouldn't do it if they got into power, and they're not in power. But beyond that, the serious, they're not even to do with me. They're also to do with barriers inside me as well. Yeah? They're also barriers that I put up out of fear, and sometimes that sort of self-denial, if you like, of an opportunity, also because of exhaustion or of a sort of a lack of capacity for imagining what it might be, yeah? An imaginative failure. Yeah, that they're also very much part of this, I think, because my DNA is white European male heterosexual. That's how I was brought up, and I was brought up to believe that story. Yeah, so I'm a convert. It's not in the same way as Rolando. It's not in me. Yeah, what in me is being a colonizer. What's in me is the position of dominance. Yeah, and the desire to maintain that is absolutely there. It's not. So you're fighting that all the time. I think that's an internal struggle that you have, and that sometimes stops you from making certain steps that maybe you could even get away with. So I see more barriers in my own psychology than in the outside world. But when you do encounter them, we did a project where we took a Picasso painting to Palestine, and one of the issues was how to export it to Ramallah when Ramallah didn't exist as an export destination in the sort of tick boxes and things like that. Now you could say, well, of course that might be political, and that's a particular way in which Israel controls things, and it's true, but it's also simply because it didn't exist as a tick box. Yeah? There was no place called Ramallah, Palestine in the tick box. So if you put a crate on to be shipped there, they don't have access to it, extraordinarily. And we solved it in the end, but nevertheless, it's that kind of obstacles that you face. And they're often legal or a question of what kind of instrument. You're using the inappropriate instrument. So I think that's where the control lies. And we should really notice the legal structures, which are the systemic things. Yeah. So it's never personal. The personal is a kind of political theatre in a way, but the real control lies at the level of the legal. And it's interesting how the political has also given way to the legal in many, that we've juridicized in a way our sort of revolutionary context. So Shell is taken to court in the legal system in order to compensate, rather than something which is discussed in the political system. And then what it does is escape the legal framework of the Netherlands and move to the United Kingdom, which doesn't care, apparently. Their legal system doesn't care about this. So therefore you have this perfect escape that's going on. But it's all done at the juridical level. So no politician has any opinion about this, except the Dutch are a bit unhappy that Shell are leaving. But basically no politician has any opinion about whether it's right or wrong. They're just saying, well, the judges will decide. The coup in America was also attempted on the basis of a kind of legal structure. He couldn't do it because he couldn't find the legal mechanism to do it, Trump. So again, if he had found the legal mechanism, or there were enough people who would say, yes, this is legal to deny Biden his victory, then it would have happened. Again, it wasn't a political argument in which he said, I should be in power because I'm the leader, which it would have been in the 1930s, yeah? So I think there's where the crux is in a way, is the instrumental and the legal.
Then it just reminds me of I believe in Holland, the Dutch government was taken to court about climate change.
Yes,
is that correct?
About nitrogen. Yeah.
There's interesting kind of connections there.
Totally.
Around the kind of legal system being used in a particular.
Yeah.
particular
And
way.
I think also that will be the next fight, actually, at the political level. Because I think what you see is a lot of governments are now trying to manipulate the legal system because it's one of the last vestiges of a kind of democratic polity that we have. But it's a very problematic one, yeah? Because also the law itself, that's what, I mean, a project that Jonas did in Framed in Amsterdam recently was around the climate change and using the law to accuse people of the climate collapse. Using the law to accuse people and how ineffective that is and how you need actually a different legal structure.
I was just wondering, in relation to your question, and what about the team, the personnel, the people that you work with? Did you encounter any difficulties also putting forward these subjects and actually digging into these histories, which are painful?
Yeah, and there are sort of ironies in that because the way that I overcame it in the beginning was by being the director and saying, well, we're going to go here because I'm the director, so sort of exerting my power.
Yeah.
And then that obviously with the flow of ideas of listening and decoloniality, that became unsustainable for me. So then it becomes much more a question of not only persuasion, but also of compromise and of moving slowly. But again, those oppositions are not framed in terms of, I don't think this is a good idea. I mean, those curators who we had when I first came left because they didn't think it was a good idea. So that would be one option, is exit. And maybe it was more possible then than it is now. But it's more to do with, but this is against our statutes or against our laws. Again, it's the limitations that are put by a depersonalized system which stops you from doing it. So we have a responsibility to look after the artworks. So therefore, you can't send it to Palestine because that will damage the artwork, and the artwork is the property of the city council. So you're behaving irresponsibly to send it to Palestine. Yeah. And then you have to have a discussion around that, because the first reaction is no, not because it's a bad idea or we don't want to have anything to do with Palestine, but it's against the law. Yeah. Or it's against the mores, it's against the customs. Yeah. And so I think that's really the mechanism that's so often used, and that's the one. Whenever somebody says, of course I would really love to do it, but somebody else or something else, more something else says you can't. That's when you should be really alert. No? You should say, okay, so what is that thing? Let's have a look at the statutes. Is that really true? How bendable are they? Can we change the statutes? Yeah, exactly. And sometimes you get political support. That happened with us. Yeah. We managed to sort of unofficially, in a way, change the statutes from 1936 with the consent of the city council, and then suddenly things become then the obstacles removed. Then people are happy with it. But there's a nervousness of I suppose the director leading people into a disaster, into collapse.
Yeah.
How long will you still be the director of the Van Abbe? Is that up to you to decide, or is that they're usually?
I had a contract when in 2005 there was still these sort of lifetime contract, well, not lifetime, till retirement contract. I've got about 10 years till retirement in 67. I think I'll be there another 2 years. That's my kind of perspective. But it often has been. But I think it's also really bad that I've been there too long in many ways. But also, there's certain things that you can do now that I couldn't have done at the beginning. There's a certain value to staying, but there's a certain level of sort of arrogance of occupying a position which could go to somebody else. The danger is that there wouldn't be a continuity. The narrative of Van Abbemuseum has been a radical break between one director and another. So, the break might be better. I don't want to necessarily control that at all. But I'm also conscious that if it feels like it would be a sort of conservative turn, I'd have a responsibility for that, even if I can't control it.
Yeah, that's why I was wondering, seeing as, like you're talking about or not the beginning, but like it being this, a life work in a way. And I'm sure like even if in 2 years, you'll find other trajectories to do that work. But I was just wondering how that works.
I think it's true. We've just started talking about the idea of a dispersed museum within the city. And that's sort of a challenge that I realize if I still get into that, then I might stay around a bit longer. So there are different things. But I think at the moment I've given myself a sort of maximum of 2 years and maybe earlier. And then I think it's time also, it's time for my generation to step aside as well.
One more last question. I can take it. I was just wondering, I mean, you've been of paramount importance in sort of this transition of how to rethink, let's say, the modern museum through the Van Abbe. You've really changed the whole perspectives on that. But at the same time, next to being a director, you have also been a curator of many exhibitions, of which, for instance, the Sao Paulo Bienal. I know which year again? 16?
14.
14.
A while ago.
How would you say that the things that you did at Van Abbe also informed you as a curator? And what kind of things did you bring with you?
Yeah.
Because in fact, you were already working on this idea of decolonizing before the word, let's say, or before the...
Yeah, in a certain sense, I think,
Yeah.
yeah, without unconsciously. But
I mean, a project like the Palestine project is
yeah,
resembles that,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about doing biennales, and I doubt I'll do another one, but the interesting thing about doing biennales, which go back to Gwangju in 2002 actually, is that for me it's always been important to do them outside of Europe. I mean, Istanbul is in Europe, but it still has a fraught relationship to Europe, at least, in the sense that that's where I've learned a lot. I think it's more than I've taken something, I've got something from those experiences. From the Sao Paulo, which was quite a fraught project, but I understood, some Brazilians here, I think, I understood the elite, you say, the elite, the power that they have within a settler colony, which is not as genocidal actually as the British settler colonies. It's interesting. So there's still a sort of presence in a different way from some of the British settler colonies. They're the worst in that way, I think. But how much that power of the colonial is really still manifested whenever you touch it. And I think so that, in a way, that made decoloniality something that I could feel in an embodied sense. I mean, I remember at one point, being really quite worried that he wasn't going to send over somebody to just shoot me in the head, the director, because he was so angry at a certain point. Yeah, it was absurd, but it was a genuine worry. I think nowadays I would think it was absurd, but I remember that you feel that in your body, when that happens. And I'm sure he's done it in the past. So I sort of had I think that was very important to giving me that sense that this is not something that's a theoretical device. And I think somebody with my privilege, it's very easy to understand decoloniality purely on the theoretical level and not to feel it. And I think it was the biennales that allowed me to feel it in different ways. So in Korea, and to feel the American influence there after the Korean Civil War, or in Turkey to feel a kind of presence of an Ottoman past that's still unresolved in a certain way. And this was when Erdogan was just starting. This was 2005, so it's much more apparent maybe now, the sort of the hurt that produced. The same as Britain. Yeah, it's interesting. Britain and Turkey are very parallel states actually. And that's where I was born, in Britain. So that those histories touched me. I'm not sure, I don't know if I brought anything at all, really, in a certain sense. I mean, I think I brought a questioning of the narratives, but I think most of the time I was too anxious to kind of rewrite certain histories that had happened before. And I think now when I look back at it, I think I should have been much more relaxed about that and tried to do my own thing. I was too much responding to what had been happened in previous biennales, maybe except Istanbul. Istanbul's the one I'm most proud of.
And you were also part of the jury of Documenta, right?
Yes.
Together with Elvira. And you chose Ruan Grupa.
Yes.
That's also kind of a shift, right? Because, I mean, it happened at Sonsbeek Biennale, but then...
Yeah.
Now we are, with Ruan Grupa, we are looking into the idea of the Lumbung.
Mm-hmm.
The decentralization, sort of.
Yeah.
It's also kind of a shift towards relationality.
Yeah, definitely. It's the core of that practice, really.
Exactly.
Non-krong.
So, but how would you see that in terms of how that also works within the context of the contemporary, or contemporary art practice, or in the context of Kassel, or in the context of how it is situated?
I said recently, I thought, what would happen if Documenta was really good for art, but not a good exhibition?
Give all its money to us. I mean, what would he do? It would cease to exist.
I don't know whether it would cease to exist. It might find another reason to exist that is not the representational spectacle.
But that's exactly the question.
So I think if we were to come out of Documenta and saying this model of exhibition isn't something that we want to continue with a new energy and a new product, that there's not this sort of iteration, which is also in the Biennales, of sort of unfolding one mega statement and then layering on top another one, often with no relation to each other. And which ones did that best or worst is one of the big discussions. Which was the best documentary over the last 20 years? Which was the worst? All those questions are actually, very, or even 30 years, are still kind of the ones that are discussed. But what if what Ruangruppe do by bringing relationality and foregrounding relationality rather than object production, moving from the idea of the object to a sort of gathering of relations, from collecting objects to gathering relations, in which objects might be tools, might play a part in that, but they're not the central device. If that shifts, I think that would be doing what Documenta should do, actually. If Documenta has a role anymore, it should be in attacking the foundations of where we are which we're not able to see our foundations. And maybe the exhibition itself, the exhibitionary complex, as it has been called, this idea of a production of representational artifacts, which then hold an argument in themselves, but also are nuanced and complex enough to hold multiple arguments. And this idea of the art as a sort of nuanced, ambiguous object which sits between discourses and connects different ones together. That if that becomes less central, and it's kind of not about black and white, but if that becomes less central, and the idea of what art can do within a community like Kassel, what energies can it release or can't it release? What kinds of platforms can be constructed that are meaningful outside of Kassel that would then feed back into a healthy, in a way, a healthy art world that would sustain Kassel ultimately, because art would still be interesting enough to show every 5 years. So that's where it could be good for art, but not necessarily. And I'm not predicting that that's going to happen. But
it's also a very practical question. In fact, also what to do with 38 million euro in a time span of 5 years, and then be able to nourish this local community and to foster a kind of work that will continue afterwards as well, and will not be shifted away because of the next batch of curators or whatever. I mean, how do you create prolonged time, let's say, or how do you create sort of an afterlife? Or
But the interesting thing I think that they're dealing with in Kassel, and I'm a little bit involved in the discussions, but tangentially, is exactly that question of what is Documenta when Documenta isn't happening. And I don't think that they'll go to Ruangruppe to answer that, but I think Ruangruppe have raised the question, which will be solved in a local way, in a German state level. But I think that's the question of the moment. I think that's why we chose them in a way, because they were the only ones who were asking that question of the candidates. Can't go into it too much, but that was the fact that they proposed a mode of working as curators that was not another narrative over and above the previous narratives was really convincing. But knowing that might produce something which wasn't recognizable as a documenta in the historic sense of it. But I think that's exactly, I would hope that that's what Documenta can embrace. It's not a biennale, it's not a big exhibition, it's not an art fair. So it has a responsibility in a way to do precisely what they're doing, I think. And if that's something that's understood in the organization, which does exist year by year by year, there's a Documenta that does go on, then I think, it could be really good for art and for us, and for relationality and positionality and glossaries of what an exhibition might mean.
Thank you. we'll call it off. Yeah, no more questions. Now we can go downstairs. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, John.